Okay, I'm gonna record myself um, kind of converting floor 7 from what we consider the Greybox version to uh, I think what you could regard as like sort of the textured version. So this is not the total process for doing all the environment design for a level, but it's sort of the base process for production art. It's applying the basic textures and getting the basic geometry set up for what you actually intend to ship. So I've already done the floor in this scene, and rather than redo it, because I know Matt in particular has already seen me do it, I'm just going to continue on from here, showing you the rest of the stuff that I would do. So I'm going to make a decision here too, which is that I'm going to give the floor a thickness, which is sort of a standard that Lynn and I have come up with recently. And while it's strictly speaking, maybe not necessary in this room, I'm going to do it for consistency anyways. So I'll show you that process. One thing I'm not going to do in this video is I'm not going to upgrade the broken tiles to have the appropriate textures, mainly because that's mostly just a programming or like art task that's not really strictly related to this. So these will eventually look like tiles with some sort of broken texture on them, but just you'll have to look past that for now because I'm not gonna spend the time on that currently. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna extrude the floor. We're going to adjust the height of the outer walls. We're going to rebuild the wall structure in this room so that it matches the source, which means we'll actually be looking at the source, and we're going to texture that as well based on what we see in the source. So it shouldn't take too long. So let's just get started. So first thing I want to do is extrude the floors. Easiest way to do this is to drag the floor up a bit so you can actually see it. And this process will be a little bit funny, but basically what we're going to do is select all the faces, and then we're going to switch to edge mode, and that will give us all the edges. And now that I've said that, I realize actually I'm not going to do that. So what I'm going to do is select these manually, because actually overall this is going to be less of a pain in the ass because there's a lot more edges than we actually need or want to extrude. And if I really cared, I could probably spend some time like maybe cleaning up the unnecessary edges in this mesh, but I don't think it matters that much, so maybe I'll eat my words, but I'm going to continue on as if it's fine. So now that I have all these edges selected, my goal is to extrude them downward by half a unit. So I can use my grid snapping, which is set to half unit. I can also set the increment snapping if I want, and then I hold shift and just drag down, and that's it. So it's a pretty simple process, and you can see that you have control over these things. You can drag them up and down. You can do whatever you want. I'm going to undo the operation and then I'll do it again. So there I've just dragged down these tiles. For a quick reference, we can also do the following. So we can grab these. We can try to use rings loop selection, but it doesn't always work, which is a frustrating feature of ProBuilder. So unfortunately, we're going to have to do this the annoying way, but this is one of those things where if the tooling was a little bit better, or maybe I knew a little bit more about it, perhaps there is some way to make this selection short of doing it the manual way, but in the interest of just getting along with it, I'm going to just do it. So you'll kind of find this is a common, feeling where you're like, there's probably some nicer way to do this, but I don't want to spend too much time trying to find it. So same operation, going to hold shift, drag down, and now the floors have some depth to them. Now, an important thing to note, I mean, I say important, I guess you could argue it's not super important, but there's no faces on the bottom of this mesh because they're never visible, so I just don't render them at all. And the other thing that's nice about not just rendering them is they also don't take up any space in your UV map. So just overall, the complexity is a bit lower by not having these. And when I say take up space, I don't mean the space is scarce. I just mean you don't have to think about it. They're not there as something that could be distracting. So let me do something real quick. I'm gonna silence this so that Okay, so now what we have to do is we have to choose what texture we're going to use on these interior faces. Let's just, for the sake of not getting hung up on it, let's just pick one. So I think what we'll pick is probably some kind of interior type texture. This is an interesting case that in some ways I haven't encountered so far, so I will show you what I'm going to do and then show you how I'm going to do it. So I'm going to select all these faces. Here I can use Alt-R to make the ring selection for me. So again, this is a bit of a shorthand. Just double check that you have selected what you actually want to have selected. Looks good. So now I'm going to use Alt-4, which just happens to be bound in our material editor to the trim. So now all these pieces have our trim texture applied to them, but you'll notice that the texture doesn't tile correctly in some sense, and that's probably because I think I extruded these too much. So that's solvable. It's just annoying. You have to basically come in here and select them. Now it's also possible that I did extrude them the right amount, and that what we're seeing is, so here I'm going to lower my grid snapping to 0.25 so that when I hold control and drag, or rather when I don't hold control and drag, I get snapping of 0.5 increments. So you can see now the texturing looks good, the tiling looks good. So I'll have to fix all of these, and again, it's a bit annoying that loop selection doesn't really work, which is frustrating. So you have to come in here and select them yourself. If I had extruded these properly, then I wouldn't have to do this, obviously, but there it is. So we'll do this one too. I think this kind of gives an impression too of like, this process does tend to be unsexy in general, but it's more technical than it might look too. You really do need to pay attention to the precision of what you're doing, especially in this game, because this game is very sensitive to collision geometry obeying certain kind of rigid rules, for the wall merge mechanic and stuff like that. So you want to be very careful that your flat surfaces really are flat, that they're not like slightly bumped or something like that. So there is definitely some attention to detail required. So now what we're going to do is just select these, and I'll show you something. So you can see that you can, if you want, you can declare these things to be laid out, quote unquote, in world space. And effectively what that does, it's a bit hard to explain, but it essentially allows you to lay out UV maps as if they were being literally textured from their position in the world. And that ends up being a useful way to do some of these things where you really want to get their tiling to come from the way they're laid out in world space. If you want a better description of what that really does, I recommend looking online or reading their documentation because it's a little subtle. But so you can see that the trim texture got applied to the extruded exterior already for us, but you can also see I made the same mistake, and so regrettably I'm going to have to now do this same selection process. And once that's done, then the floor portion of this will be mostly done. And we'll move on to how to do the walls. Try to use the hotkeys when you can. It's like all pieces of software. Like, you're not going to know the hotkeys at the beginning, and you're going to be really tempted to just click everything, but the hotkeys are pretty important if you actually want to be productive. So there's the floor done. Okay, so here's what it looks like. So pretty basic. Now the final thing that we're going to do is we're going to deprobuilderize this. So that's not a technical concept, deprobuilderizing. You can see here in gray is probuilderize, and the reason that's gray is because this object already is a ProBuilder object. And when I say that, what I mean is it has a ProBuilder mesh filter on it, which is like a real Uber component that sort of encapsulates all of the ugly messiness of creating a mesh and making it editable. And I won't talk too much about what's happening here, but the mesh is serialized on this game object by ProBuilder. That's how the mesh is stored. What we are going to do instead is we're going to export that mesh to be a static asset on the file system, and we're going to get rid of all the ProBuilder stuff altogether so that this object at runtime is just a standard rendered mesh. And you can do that in such a way that you maintain all of your materials as well, which is I won't dive into the details of that right now, but that's an important thing. If you want a little peek at how that works, there are two materials on this object. The way that Unity and 3D engines in general more or less handle this is that under the hood, all of the faces in your mesh that have one material on them will be grouped together as what people just call a submesh. It's what it sounds like. And then that will be true for every chunk of faces in your mesh that shares a material. Each of those forms a submesh. The nice thing about Unity / ProBuilder is that it generates and maintains those submeshes for you based on the materials. So it's pretty convenient. So the way you're really to read this is that each of these materials is in turn applied to submesh at index 0, submesh at index 1, etc. So if you've ever wondered what's really happening in Unity, that's what's actually happening. And so that's why applying multiple materials to an object naively doesn't always work the way you might imagine. But in this case, it works exactly sort of the way it's intended. So here's the workflow. We're going to hit export, which weirdly doesn't seem to have a hotkey. There's a bunch of options in export. You can export as an asset, a prefab, a PLY. These are file formats for exporting to other 3D softwares. So this is OBJ, STL, and PLY. You can select include children if your mesh has sub-meshes that are child meshes. That's not the case here. It occasionally comes up, and replace source basically will swap the components on this object with the standard components, which is basically mesh filter. So you want that. Most of the time you'll want that. So we're going to click export. Where I've been storing these is in a folder called floors, and I create a new folder for each floor that I have exported meshes for. So here is me creating the folder for floor 7. And then the name of it is up to you. It's just the name of the mesh that will appear on the file system. Floor is fine. So that will do exactly what I said. So here's the asset. So it's just a mesh, just like any other mesh. You can see it, that's all it is. And notice it's not textured, right? Because like a mesh as a data structure doesn't have textures. It is just a set of vertices. But what you can see is that they've color coded it by submesh, and that corresponds to the different materials that are applied on this mesh. So there's a light blue for one and then this white for the other. That's not super important, but I'm just showing you the details. So here's the mesh once it's been de-ProBuilderized. You can see basically it's just a standard mesh filter pointing at a static mesh on the file system and a mesh renderer that has two materials on it that work exactly as I said before. And then we're going to use a mesh collider. There's some things you can do for optimization where you get rid of the mesh collider, but we're not going to do that here. But you could also place a whole bunch of box colliders here, which might be a performance optimization in some cases. We're not going to do it. So then I would just put the floor down where it goes. Another thing you can do that is somewhat useful, not super relevant here because it's already in a good place, but you can reset the pivot of a mesh. And I'm not going to show it to you now because I've de-ProBuilderized this mesh, nor is it necessary, but I will try to show it on the next thing that we're doing. So notice that our floor now hangs down half a unit from where it used to be, so to speak. So if we were just trying to keep these exterior walls, what we might do is select these faces and drag them down. And I could even show you that process. Well, I won't because it's a bit redundant, but I'll show it to you just for the sake of illustrating what I'm saying. So since we are making the floors be a half unit thick, we need the exterior walls that correspond to that floor in the game to be also an additional half unit thicker. Another thing that stands out to me that you could optimize here is you could delete these faces. And the way you delete a face is very simple. You just select the face and you hit backspace. If you hit delete, it will delete the whole object, which is, obviously not what you want. So just be aware that that distinction exists. And when you're trying to align things, what I will tend to do is go into a non-perspective rendering mode. So you can click these fucking awful widgets up here until you manage to make that happen. The way I typically do that is this little thing here corresponds to the orientation for your scene view camera. I think you might be able to set that up. Nope, doesn't look like it. So this is basically going between perspective rendering and orthographic. This is perspective, this is orthographic, perspective, orthographic. And the way I find that tends to work the best is I click these cardinal axes until I get basically the orientation that I'm interested in, and then I switch, or until I get the perspective that I'm interested in, and then I will switch the orientation. And I don't really know why that's necessary, but that seems to work the best in practice. So what I'm checking here is whether I've extruded these walls enough, and in this particular case I have not extruded them enough. So I would drop them by another half step, and I will also look to see. So there's two options for dragging objects in general. There's control dragging objects, and then there's using grid snapping. Grid snapping only works when you're in global mode. So if you're in local mode, grid snapping doesn't work. Don't ask me why, because I literally can't think of a single reason why, but that's how it is. So this is the process if we were keeping these walls. Obviously this is a sort of a trivial process. So let's show you what I'm actually going to do. So what I'm actually going to do is build new walls, and the way I'm going to do this is probably by using a poly shape. So here I'm going to create a new poly shape, and the shape that I want to create is it's different for every room. So there's no like standard thing. Now there's obviously a million ways you can do this, but here I'm going into my top-down view. It's just an easier place to lay out floor plans. This is kind of like a standard practice in all kinds of software that's responsible for layout of some kind. And I'm just going to trace out the shape of the walls. I know what I actually want is something like this, so I will trace out that shape. I'll talk more about the actual exact positioning of these verts later, but let's just get the basic shape in place. Okay, and then you can just pick an extrusion. I just pick one. Doesn't matter. You're gonna mess with it plenty. So one thing that's nice to do at this point is to go down, go into face selection mode, select the bottom face, and there's a hotkey for this, but I forgot what it is. Control J. That will move the pivot to the average position of whatever you have selected. So in this case, it will push it down to be flush with the bottom of the floor and in the center, which is just convenient because it makes it so that you can just place this object at 0 in your local coordinate system, and it will go, it will be where you want it to be, essentially. So if that doesn't make sense, it will make sense in time for sure. Okay, so now we want to position it. Sorry, we want to leave face selection mode and select the object and slide it into place. Looks like we got some of these vertices a little wrong. So what we might want to do is set the height to 0 if it will allow us to do that. Let's do this. We're going to reset it. We're going to set it to 0. And I'll explain why. The main reason is that the less you want to keep as little geometry as necessary for whatever operation it is that you're doing at that time. And right now what we're just trying to do is get the floor layout right. So by extruding it, we're like almost doubling the number of vertices whose positions we might have to adjust. And that's not worth it in general at this stage. So here's another stupidity about ProBuilder. I've tried to maximize this window, and when I try to maximize this window, the ProBuilder controls aren't there. It's complete stupidity. I don't know why it happens. So what I'll do instead is this disgusting operation of resizing the window, and then I will grab the vertices, and here's where we're going to take advantage of vertex snapping. This is quite an ugly process, but the idea is to position these vertices exactly how we want them and make sure that they are snapped to the grid. Uh, this is nothing short of arcane bullshit. I will freely admit that, but it is absolutely essential that you do this. Um, you need, in this game, in particular in this game, we have to have the geometry aligned because these floors will stack on top of each other. And so there's this kind of tedious process of using grid snapping to ensure that the geometry is really laid out the way that it should be. You'll see that like eventually this process is not so bad, nor does it define most of the effort that goes into creating these floors, but these are little stupid steps. And there's some potential for these steps to be obviated in some cases, but in general, this is what we're going to do. I think for the interest of expediency, I'm also going to hide these. These are the old walls. This will just make it easier to see. And maybe we will not adjust any vertices that we don't think are actually problematic and see how it goes. So getting this shape wrong will just make your life a lot worse because you'll have to fix it later and there will be a lot more geometry involved. So this is, I would say, a real precept of working in 3D is you really want to try to get the basic shapes done correctly before you build off of those shapes. It sounds obvious, and it is obvious, but so this to me looks pretty good. I mean, you know, in some sense. So what I'm going to go down, I'm going to go out to my tower view, and I'm going to. So this is a stupid thing that's required of working with ProBuilder currently. Explaining why is a bit beyond the scope of things, but I'm going to revert all the changes that it thinks exists on floor 7. That's just a stupidity that can be explained another time. What I'm looking for is to see if I have the shape right, and it turns out I think I don't have the shape right. So I need to drag the verts out by a little bit. So I will go back into my tower and go into vertex selection mode. Drag them out. I think that's actually the correct position. Yeah. There's another way to do this. Let me show it to you. If you hit Control-Shift-K, that will create a new ProBuilder shape. You can just drag the ProBuilder. So I happen to know that the size of this corner piece is a 2x2. And this is another way that you can quickly get the corners to be positioned the way that you actually wanted them to be. So now I can just say, well, that's a 2x2 square, so I'll just line up the vertices on my walls to match up with that shape. And you can move the shape to the next corner. So it's clearly the case that like it could possibly be more expedient to begin from some base mesh and then edit that. That might be true. It's one of these things where I haven't committed the time to explore that because the work doesn't take that long. But yeah, so there's that. Okay, so now I think the mesh is probably okay. So now I'm going to go back, revert so that I'm not seeing a stale mesh, double check that it lines up correctly. It looks pretty good to me. So I'm going to go back into the floor that I'm working on, which is floor 7. And at this point, my goal is basically to extrude these walls up, to build up the doorway, which is a pretty annoying process, and then to create whatever trim detailing is necessary for this floor. So I think without further ado, let's just select this face, hold Shift, extrude it up. We go to the top of the doorway, and why we do that will become clear momentarily. So we want to create sort of a line of vertices and edges that's flush with the top of the doorway, and then we will hold shift again and we'll drag up again, and that will cause us to create another set of geometry. And now there's probably a lot of ways to do this, and I don't know what the preferred way to do this is, but what I do is I select one of these two faces and I hit backspace to delete that face. Then I select the other one and I hold shift and I extrude it towards the face that I ultimately want to merge. And then here is a thing about ProBuilder that I don't really understand. And maybe this could be improved, and that would be great if somebody could figure it out. But at the moment, I'll just show you the gross thing that I do. So what we want to do is fuse these vertices. That's what we're attempting to do here. And the way, or the technical term in this package is weld. So we want to weld them. So I'm going to set the weld distance to 0.5 and push the button. And you'll see that it does this pretty odd thing that I don't really understand why it does this. It's basically welded the vertices and then sort of created this gibberish look. It's very strange. But if you select this face that you don't want, which is a bit odd, and hit backspace and delete it, then you get the thing that you're actually after. There's obviously something missing in my understanding of what's going on here, so I'm not telling you this is sane, but I'm just telling you how I have been dealing with it so far. So we align those vertices with the door, and now we basically have carved out the doorway. So that's why that process is necessary. Okay, so now the basic thing that we just need to do is know how tall these walls are supposed to be, and then know what their texture and detailing is supposed to look like. So the basic thing that we do know is we know that the top of the wall is going to have the top wall texture, which looks like this. It's just a placeholder because we haven't decided what this will look like yet. And I'm going to undo that for reasons that will become clear in a moment, but it basically has to do with when I extrude this wall more, it will apply that texture to everything that I've extruded, which is probably not the texture that I want. So don't worry about that if it sounds like hand-wavy bullshit. So now what I'm doing is I'm selecting all of the faces that I want to texture, which is the exterior walls. They're generally the easiest ones to get right for reasons passing understanding. It sometimes does other bullshit, but just select the walls that you want. You can always fix this later, and then apply the wall texture. And go ahead and click World Space. Again, not super important, but it's a good general practice that tends to work most of the time. And then here I'm going to select this top face, and I'm going to push Alt G, and that will grow the selection for all faces that are within some angle of the original face. So you can look at the tool tip for that for more details, and we're going to go ahead and apply the top wall texture here. So that's the basic setup for how to create and texture the walls. And then let's go ahead and look at the base game. So I have recordings of the base game. So I'm going to kill the sound, and I will find this room. I think this room is probably around here or so. There's a million ways you could do this, obviously. So here, eventually, we're going to go up to the room in question, probably about here. Yep. Okay, so what we're looking for is how tall the room is, and we're going to count it in bricks. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It's 9 bricks high by the way we count. So I just doing this to get an approximate size. We'll adjust all this stuff in our own game a little bit. But the bricks in the game, in the source game, it's 2 bricks per Unity unit, and that's an exact translation. So when you're counting bricks, divide by 2, and that's how many units high this should be. So strictly speaking, that this wall should be 9 bricks, which is 4.5 Unity units high. I'll probably just make mine 5 Unity units high, which is how high it actually happens to be already. So there's that. Another thing that's important, though, is that I've messed up slightly with these edges. These edges should be lower. So I'm going to select Actually, let's look at this real quick. There might be a nice way to do this. Select whole? Let's possibly select whole. You gotta be real careful with these selection tools to make sure you haven't selected stuff you didn't want to. So, but that being said, this looks good. So I think this might be okay. So here we're going to do the thing I told you where I'm going to go into a orthographic view. This allows me to ensure that I've actually lined up the floor with the inner floor. So now we've done what I intended to do. So now the inner floor, which has a thickness of a half, is matched by the thickness of the outer walls, if that somewhat hand-wavy nonsense makes sense. So it looks like this currently. We'll deal with this area momentarily. Okay, so then the other thing that we're going to note is that there's this trim detailing in here. We've been doing a little different stuff. I'll show you what we do. So we will basically select these walls. We'll hold Shift and we'll drag them up. Okay. And then we will use grid snapping to try to get them to be the height that we want, which is 1/2. Stuff is kind of shitty, so sometimes it's a little tedious to do. We missed something in our selection, so we're going to undo. We're going to fix that. And we'll probably use extrusion. Let's use extrusion because we can set the value and then just avoid having to use grid snapping stuff at all. We want to extrude at 1. Sorry. 1. Actually want to extrude it by half. That's the size of trim in our game. So there's that. So this piece we'll select. We'll select one of the faces and then use Alt R, which is ring selection. That will select everything. We're going to give this the trim texture. We're going to put it in world space UVs and kind of check to see what this looks like in world space. Looks probably like it will work fine. Give it a quick glance. At a glance, it looks okay. That's enough for now. And then we're going to select the top here again, making sure to select this little piece that doesn't get selected for God knows what reason. And we're going to extrude again. And this extrusion is a bit more complex. So we're going to click extrude, which is Control E. So there's another, when you don't need the parameters, you can use the hotkey. Or when the parameters are what you already wanted. We're going to drag all these walls back by half a unit, exactly half a unit. That's just our standard. And why we're doing that will become clear pretty soon. We're creating a little indented wall detail. Okay, so now I've dragged all the walls back. So now I'm going to go back into face selection. And I'm going to drag these faces down so that they're in the plane with the other faces. So it's going to look like this. Okay. So now that we've done that, I'm kind of sanity checking it because it doesn't quite look right to me. So maybe I'll go into this mode and see if, yeah, so it doesn't, something about when I dragged these out didn't do what I wanted. I'm not sure what. But anyways, I'm using snap to grid to drag those walls so that they have exactly the positioning that I wanted them to have. So give it another look. Seems like it might be right. So then select one of these faces, Alt R to ring select. And this should also get the trim texture. So this is Alt 4. And also make these in world space. Okay, and then just give it a quick sanity check, and it looks pretty decent. So you can see we've created this trim detailing at the top of the wall. And then the last thing to do is select the wall again, get the face over the door that gets left out of the auto selection, and Control E and extrude once more. Notice we're not extruding the trim. Obviously, we're just extruding the wall itself. And then use Alt R to select these faces. because these should obviously be wall textured faces. And you can see here that it's applied the top wall texture to them like I said it would earlier. So we're going to now apply the wall texture to those faces. And now the result looks like this. And to, a first approximation, this is essentially what you're going for. This is essentially what it ought to look like. So there's a bit of work that happens after this, making the floors line up with each other, but this is the essential process. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to look at the tower, and I'm going to find out how I'm going to undo or revert and see how close we are to the current game. And we're actually very close, mostly by dumb luck. So I think we're actually done with this. So you can see that there's something screwy happening there, some Z fighting, which is an indication of something weird. So we're going to drag this up and see if we can figure out what is happening there. And I think the answer is very simple, which is just that this floor needed to be dragged up in this scene view by 1/2 unit. And now that and that's because we made the floors thicker. And you can see that this is introducing problems, which we will have to fix, but I'm not going to put that in the scope of this video for now because it's just additional stuff. But at a high level, with some amount of detail, this is the process for texturing a floor, for giving it the right geometry. The final thing that we'll do is we'll go back into floor 7, which is the floor that we've been working on. We'll select this poly shape, we'll call it the walls, and we will deprobuilderize this as well. So the process again is to hit export. We want it to be an asset, so we'll click export. We'll go to our floors, we'll go to floor 7. We'll say that this is the walls mesh, and you can see that now this is completely not a ProBuilder object at all. It's just a standard mesh. And that's it in a nutshell. You can see some frustrating things about this. So there's a lot of attention to detail stuff that matters. Like I can see that these UVs are not exactly correct. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to undo that process, and I'm going to try to address some of these issues. So I don't know why it's doing that, but let's get rid of it. So these, I don't fully understand everything about this process yet, but what I do know is that if you select a face that is the way that you want it to be, and you hold Control, and you select adjacent faces to it, it will lay them out adjacently in the UV map, and oftentimes that resolves alignment issues. It's not always the case, and I'm not convinced that I fully understand this process in great detail, but if you can see what's happening in the UV maps, they're getting updated as I do this kind of weird process. I don't really know why this happens sometimes, but that's UV mapping is a black art and it's a bit gross. So we're just doing this control selection thing so that we get these brick textures to be aligned. There's probably other ways you can do this too. I want to stress that, but just showing you the general workflow that I've been using recently. So you can see here, for example, like why these aren't aligning. I don't know. I don't really understand what it's doing. It seems to get sort of fucked up for reasons that don't seem particularly logical to me. But anyways, that's the general process, and then you might check the same thing in here so you can see the same issues happening there. So Control Select will help you snap those together in UV space. Looking around at a glance, it looks relatively sane. There's some fussy details that I probably won't worry about now, but we might want to have all of these be UV offset. Yeah, see, fuck. There's something that goes kind of pear-shaped when you do this. I don't really understand. Like, why is it selecting this? I don't know. I don't know why it's doing that. It's really annoying. Another thing we can do is we can delete these inner faces. We don't need these because there's going to be a door here. So just select the faces and hit backspace. and then move the floor back where it needs to be, like that. You can see this tiling is wrong. I wish I understood this more. I don't really understand it. Like I certainly understand the theory, but when it comes to what the auto UV is doing, I don't really know why it's done the wrong thing here. You can see that these pieces are disjoint in UV space, and there's no reason for that I understand. So if you group them, then it forces them to be together in UV space, which is what we want. But I don't really know why it's necessary. It's kind of I'm not sure what's going on there. Let's see what happens if you ring select and group. That doesn't really look good at all. Yeah. This stuff is sadly, yeah, it's a bit frustrating. I won't lie. There's some tedious bits here, and there's probably still some learning to be done. Like I suspect there's reasons for this stuff, but I don't know it in great detail. Stop messaging me, fuck. But you can patch it up, and see, yeah, it's frustrating. I don't have enough time probably to really solve this. So probably in the interest of time, I won't. Maybe the way to do this is to select each of these pieces and group them. That might be the sane thing to do. That looks possibly like it's producing a better result. So, like I say, I'm still learning some things about this, so take what I say to some degree with a grain of salt. Let's see what happens here. Okay. Okay. Okay, well, there you go. So now maybe we will deprobuilderize this. Wow. I don't know. I think those are, oh, these are coins. These are wall space coins. I'm not sure. Interesting. I'll have to think about that later. Okay, so anyways, the process is to export it. So hit export, go to floors, go to floor 7. You can save right over the asset. It'll override it. And there you go. So you can see it's preserved the UV maps. So here it's fucked them up, or I fucked them up. I don't know. But very frustrating experience in general. So I'll undo it. I'll try to do this once more and see if it will not fuck them up. Let's try once more to see if I can export this successfully. I won't pretend to understand exactly what goes wrong when it goes wrong, but take a look at your mesh. It's very good to take a look at your mesh as soon as you export it, because if you have a mistake, you can just undo that export, and that's a much easier process than re-pro-builderizing it. You can also re-pro-builderize. Okay, so anyways, I think that's enough for this video, so I will cut it off there.